Well, we're going to try to finish up Anthropology today. And thus far in the class, we've spent most of our time talking about, issues related to creation. And so we've kind of put that discussion behind us. And we're going to look at three more subtopics within anthropology. Man's uniqueness. I guess I should say humanity's uniqueness. So man and woman. And then humanity's material nature. That would deal with the body. The Bible reveals a lot about our physical bodies. And then man's immaterial nature. That has to do with our soul, or the part of us that's eternal, that you can't see necessarily. So those are the three things we're looking at. But let's just spend a little time on man's uniqueness. And one of the things to understand is that man is higher than the animals. Now, are there similarities between man and the animals? Yes, there are. So let's look at a few of those. Jazz, can you look at Genesis 1, 20 and 21, and I'll have you read a few more there in chapter 1. And Claudia, can you look at Revelation 8, verse 9? And Stephanie, can you look at Genesis 6, verse 17? And Abner, can you look at Genesis 5:1? And Michelle, Genesis 2:7. And all right, who has Genesis 1, 20 and 21?
I do. It goes, Then God said, "Let the waters teem with the swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and God saw that it was good."
And then read verse 24 also.
Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind." And so it was. So
you see where it says living beings, describing the animals. The Hebrew there is nephesh. And that's the same word that's used to describe humanity. So there's some kind of life-giving power within animals, and God has given that to us as well. So there very clearly is some similarities between us and the animals. Who has Revelation 8:9?
The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third of the ships were destroyed.
Okay, where it talks about creatures in the sea, living things. The Greek word there is suke. And from that word we get soul. From that word we get psychology, which means the study of the soul, basically, suke. But you'll notice that animals have that. So there's something within them that's the life God provided. You see the same word in Revelation 16, verse 3. And who has Genesis 6:17?
I do. "Behold, even I am bringing the flood of the waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life. From under heaven, everything that is on the earth shall perish."
So, breath of life. The animals having the breath of life. Genesis 6:17, Genesis 7, verse 15, Genesis 7, verse 22. All teach this. So it's interesting to me that we have a lot of similarities between us and the animals, and so sometimes we overstate the case and say we're completely different than the animals, which really isn't true. They have a nephesh, they have a suke, and they have the breath of life, as do we. But having said all that, man is very different than the animal kingdom. And there are two things that really make him different. One is the fact that he is the only being that God created, that God directly breathed life into his nostrils. I mean, we're not told that he did that with any other animal, where there was a direct breath from God to man. And who has Genesis 2:7?
I do. Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being.
See, there was something special God did with man. He breathed directly into his nostrils the gift of life, or the breath of life. It's not said that of any animal. And there's something else that's very distinct about man in comparison to the animals. Man is the only being that God ever created that's an image bearer of God. And we'll be talking about what that means later, but that's not said of any animal. I don't even think it's said of the angels. So we actually are image bearers of God. Who has Genesis? Well, who was in Genesis 1? Was it you, Jazz? Can you read Genesis 1:26?
Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth."
So man is made in God's image. Can you go over to Genesis 5:1 and read that? This is even after the fall.
Genesis 5:1, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God."
So those are the two differences between us and the animals, despite a few similarities. We have this almost mouth-to-mouth operation that's performed there, where God breathes into man life. And then the second thing is we're image bearers of God. So we are not simply evolved animals. We're a different species in the animal kingdom. So our understanding of it is very different than Darwin, who said, you can go down to the Houston Zoo and look at the orangutans and see your uncle and grandpa, in there, or your great-great-uncle. Yes, we're similar to the animals in some respects, but we're very, very different. And this is reflected in the New Testament. Let's see, John, can you look up Matthew 6, verses 25 and 26? And Michael, can you look up Matthew 12, 11, and 12? In the teachings of Jesus, he indicates that man is different, is more valuable than the animals. Okay, go ahead, John.
For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. It's not life more than food, and body more than clothing. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they?
So you see how in the teachings of Jesus, we are worth much more than the animals? So he's basically saying, look, God takes care of the birds. They've got enough to eat and so forth. He gives them shelter. Won't he take care of you? Especially considering the fact that you're more valuable than the animals. Well, why are we more valuable than the animals? Because we're the objects of God's life-giving breath, and we're image bearers. So there's a big philosophy today amongst environmentalists, and I think we as Christians should be environmentalists. We shouldn't be out to trash the planet, but we should be good stewards of what God has given. But there's a very radical element in it where they don't mind, shutting down a whole industry of workers, who need to provide for their families, because of some remote animal on the endangered species list. So you can see how priorities get out of whack on some of these things. And I think Jesus would say we're higher than the animals. So we ought to be in favor of policies that put man first and animals second. But we're, of course, in the Levitical law, there's provisions for the animals. Give the animals rest, don't abuse the animals. Like these people that get these pit bulls, and they train them to be killers, and they let them devour each other. That's ungodly as well. So, God is calling us to be balanced in our thinking. Matthew 12:11 and 12 teaches the same thing.
Matthew 12:11 and 12 reads, He said to them, Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep?
So they're bent out of shape there, the Pharisees are, because Jesus is breaking their man-made rules about the Sabbath. And he healed somebody on the Sabbath. And the disciples were eating on the Sabbath. Now that didn't violate the Sabbath, it violated their rules, you see. So he says the point of the Sabbath is for man. That's why God gave the Sabbath, so man could have a rest. And he says, look at what you do on the Sabbath. If your animal, I think it's an ox, is it? Falls into a ditch. Was it an ox or a lamb? I don't remember. A sheep, there we go. Falls into a ditch, aren't you going to pull it out on the Sabbath? Well, what's the matter with me then healing on the Sabbath? Considering the fact that a man, how does he say it here? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So why is a man more valuable than a sheep? A man bears God's image, and a man is the object of God's life-giving breath. So that's kind of a proper understanding of who we are regarding the animals. We're similar, but we're very different, and we're more valuable, but that doesn't give us any right to abuse the animals. Does that make sense? So, we're made in the image of God. What exactly does that mean? Well, can you reread, Jazz, Genesis 1, 26 and 27?
Then God said, Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the earth, over the birds of the sky, and over all the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them.
So we are made in the image of God. Now, does that apply across the genders?
Yes.
So both men and women are image bearers of God. So the biblical position on men and women is both have equal value. So chauvinism, where the man elevates his importance over the woman, is unbiblical. Feminism, where the woman elevates her importance over the man, is unbiblical. Both man and woman, male and female, equally share as image bearers of God. 1 Peter 3:7 says both men and women are joint as Christians, are joint heirs of salvation. So that's how I look at my wife. I don't look at her as someone to dominate or control or someone less valuable than me, because my Bible says she's an image bearer of God, as am I. Matter of fact, in that passage, read the next verse, verse 28.
God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth.
Okay, God put man in authority over the earth. And he said to who to rule it? He said to them. So they're joint rulers, co-rulers. Now, that doesn't mean, as you get into the New Testament and other places, that men and women don't play different roles, right? For example, in Ephesians 5, the head of the home, the head of the marriage is the man. He's to love his wife as Christ loved the church. The woman is to submit and respect to her husband. But that's not a statement of worth or value. That's a statement of role, right? So there's a big difference between differences in ontology, which means value, and differences in function, which is referring to role. And people get this confused constantly. People think if you say the husband is the head of the house or the marriage, that you're saying that the husband is more valuable than the woman. No, it's a statement of function or role. It's not a statement of ontology or value. So even within the Godhead, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, right? Do they all share the same ontology? Yes, they do. We could go through a ton of verses that show that the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. But the Son, who is fully God, does what with respect to the Father? Submits. Didn't Jesus say over and over again, "Not my will be done, but thy will be done"? And I pray that this cup passes from me. Nevertheless, let your will be done. So if he's equal to the Father, then how come he's in submission to the Father? Well, he's in submission to the Father in terms of function or role. But he's equal to the Father in terms of essence, ontology, or value. So within the church and within marriage, God calls men and women to play different roles. But that is not saying that there's some sort of ontological or value distinction between men and women, because you go right back to original creation and you see both genders are image bearers, both genders are co-rulers, both genders are joint heirs of salvation. Does this make any sense? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question just about how, you may or may not have an answer, but how did the cultural practices of that day towards women in that particular region, particularly, how did they get so skewed, I guess, from the way the original, and this is what the original scripture said, yet in the culture, in that day, the women were treated as such, even to the fact that Christ, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Christ used this particular fact in presenting himself arisen. Is that he presented himself arisen to a woman first, so as it's been taught to kind of confirm that this is not a hoax. If this was a hoax, then why would I choose a woman who, because in that day, her in the culture was her witness or her word or her relevance was very, very minor compared to those of a man. And so it's really a confusing picture.
Yep.
If God intended this to be this way, then here in his resurrected state, why would this, and even if that's not true, that's just some theology that some man used to try and explain the risen Christ, to try to, for the sake of apologetics. Why is that so? It's carnage. It's a stark difference.
Well, I would just say what God's pattern got lost with the fall. And you go around the world and look at any country, like an Islamic country that has no Christian influence. By the way, rent the movie if you get a chance, called Not Without My Daughter. Did you see that? With Sally Field. And it's really, that was made, I think, in the 70s, if I remember right, or 80s. And it's astonishing to see Islam grow and dominate since that movie. But, it's basically the story of how this guy, marries this girl. And, he basically says, come back to my country to visit, I want to visit my mom. And then he gets her back there and he says, you're not getting out. I think they went to Iran or somewhere. He starts beating her up and all this kind of stuff, and she can't go out without her head covered and all these things. So I would say all that came in with the fall, the culture, and Jesus basically came to restore what was broken. That's why in John 4, he's dialoguing with not just a woman, but a Samaritan. If you know anything about the Samaritans, they were the rejected race. And the disciples couldn't even believe he was talking to her. So there's a lot of people that want to, and to me it's laughable. They want to blame the plight of women on the Bible. Women are abused because of the Bible. And I would argue it's the exact opposite. The Bible has done more to elevate the status of woman than any other book. But you're right, it got lost through the culture, and Christ came, to restore what was broken. But both are image bearers of God. Now, being an image bearer does not mean, before we talk about what it does mean, an image bearer does not mean that we are deity. Now, why are we not deity? Because God has certain attributes that are incommunicable. Anybody know what that means? It means he doesn't share them. Right? Now, if God didn't have certain attributes that he doesn't share and he alone possesses, he wouldn't be God, right? So this chart here basically shows you the differences between man and God. God is omniscient. Jesus even knew what would have happened with Sodom had they received more light and revelation. He knew the choice they would have made. But man is not omniscient, because God asked Job, what? Where were you? In other words, he's quizzing him about things he wasn't there to see. God is omnipotent, meaning all-powerful. He's called the Almighty. We obviously are not omnipotent or all-powerful, because Hebrews 4 verse 15 says, we have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses. I've got weaknesses. I mean, I'm abnormally tired today. I'm not normally this tired, so obviously I'm not omnipotent. God is omnipresent, meaning he's everywhere at the same time. David said in Psalm 139, where can I flee from your presence? If I go to Sheol, you're there. If I go to heaven, you're there. No matter where I go, you're there. Obviously, man is not omnipresent. Did you have to travel to get here this morning? Or this afternoon? Yeah. I mean, if you're omnipresent, you wouldn't have to travel. You'd just be there. God is holy. He's clothed in unapproachable light. We're sinful, are we not? Isaiah 64:6 says this, God is eternal. He's always been. There never was a time in which God was not, and yet we were created, weren't we? When did you begin? At the point of conception. That's the biblical position. In God, there's total truth. Jesus says, I am the way, the what? Truth, and the life. And yet our hearts are deceitful. Jeremiah 17:9 says that, right? God is perfectly just. One of these days, Jesus is going to judge the world. Acts 17:31 says, in perfect judgment. There's no fact that's going to escape his notice. No one will have to appeal the decision. And yet we're lawless by nature. 1 John 3:4. God is perfectly loving, and he is love. 1 John 4:8 says God is love, and yet we try to be loving, but many times we're not loving. We're beset by jealousies and things like that. So, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? It doesn't mean that we're deity. Because God has attributes that are incommunicable that he doesn't share. Also, the fact that the fall occurred has not altered the fact that man is still an image bearer of God. Even in the post-fall world, man shares God's image. So a lot of people think, well, there was a fall, and it's true that man was originally made in the image of God, but the fall erased the fact that man is an image bearer. And the proper way of thinking about it is the fall effaced but did not erase our status as image bearers. So Katie, can you look up Genesis 9:6, and Dorothy, can you look up James 3:9? And Michael, can you look up Ephesians 4:23 and 24? And John, can you look up Colossians 3:10? James 3:9, yeah. And Christine, can you look up Psalm 8, verses 4 through 6? And Vladimir, Psalm 139, verse 14. Joyce, Acts 17:26. Michelle, Romans 5:12. And Claudia, Romans 8:20 through 22. And Abner, Genesis 1:27 through 28. And Aretha, Genesis 1:31. And Stephanie, Romans 12:1 and 2. And Jazz, 1 Corinthians 6:19 through 20. Just kind of continue to explore this idea that we're image bearers. Now this will be on the test, just to let you know. If I ask you for some scriptures that say the fall effaced man's image bearer status but didn't erase it, these would be the scriptures you could use. But one is Genesis 9:6. Who has that one?
Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man.
Now that's not only after the fall, that's after the flood. Right? And God specifically says, in the image of God has God made man. And he, in the post-flood world, set up the institution of human government. And he put into the hands of the state the sword. Now why did God do that? God did it because of what was going on before the flood. Anybody recall what was going on before the flood? You had a wild, wild west type of scenario where everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes, and there was great violence upon the earth. Can you read, Katie, Genesis 6:11?
Yes. And I will establish my covenants with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth.
Let's see, was that chapter 6, verse 11?
I'm sorry.
It's all right, I may have not.
6:11.
Uh-huh.
6:11. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence.
So what was the earth like before the flood? Violent. By the way, the Hebrew word there for violence, those of you that follow the news, see if this rings a bell. The word is Hamas. Who knows what Hamas is?
Terrorist.
Yeah, it's a terrorist group. And they're functioning there in the Middle East. They're still using Semitic languages, and so they name their group Violence. So that's something to keep in mind when they portray themselves as wanting peace. Well, and because the West doesn't understand anything about Hebrew, we don't connect the dots. They don't want peace, or why would they name their group Violence, right? So Hamas was all over the world prior to the flood. So after the flood, when the 8 got out of the boat, and Noah, specifically his 3 sons, began to repopulate the earth, and the world was repopulated, did the sin nature disappear from man? No. Noah got drunk and all sorts of things are going on there. So the sin nature is still there. So how does God prevent the world from experiencing the Hamas that it was experiencing before the flood? He creates the institution of human government through what's called the covenant with Noah. It's the first covenant in the Bible. It's called the Noahic Covenant. And there's a lot of provisions in it. But one of the things God did is he put in the hands of the state the sword, which actually deters violence, doesn't it? So it's the idea of deterrence. You're so afraid of doing the time that you don't do the crime. And so man in his sinfulness is either going to be restrained by as our founding fathers of our country said, he'll either be restrained by the Bible or the bayonet. So if you're not going to be held back through Christianity and Christian truth, you will be held back through the threat of punishment. So I was very tempted to drive in here today about 85 miles an hour. Why didn't I do that? Well, because of the officer with the speed thing where he can... So I was held back from doing something bad that could have hurt somebody, not because I'm such a good person, but because I didn't want to pay the fine and all that stuff. So that's why God put the sword into the hands of the state, and that has never been abrogated. Paul in Romans 13 in the New Testament talks about the government, and he says we ought to pray for government, respect government, submit to government, pay our taxes, and all these kinds of things. And he says they don't bear the sword for no reason. So the sword is repeated there in the New Testament. And so the whole logic of capital punishment, and this is not a political Republican versus Democrat thing. This is Bible we're talking about here. The whole logic of capital punishment is to hold people back from evil. And that way there'll be less Hamas in the world. And God doesn't want man's blood shed in a wild, wild west scenario because of what reason? Man bears whose image? God's. So man has value to God because he's an image bearer. So the whole logic of capital punishment emanates from that. You follow what I'm trying to say? So the fall and the flood did not erase, but rather effaced our image bearer status. So people matter to God. Even the unsaved, we're talking about unsaved people here. Even if you're unsaved, you still have value.
What's the scripture for Noahic Covenant?
It's in Genesis 8 and 9. The end of 8 and the first 10 verses or so of chapter 9. All right, who has James 3:9?
James 3:9 reads, with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God.
So this, now, notice that now this is already into the 1st century AD. The fall has happened thousands of years ago. And man in the 1st century is an image bearer of God. And James uses that as an exhortation to avoid what? What's James 3 about? The tongue. The 2x2 slab of mucous membrane between our gums that does more damage than any other part of our body, right? So he's talking about church life. Now, good thing we don't have gossip in churches, so we don't have to worry about it. But James here is talking about what's going on in the church, the early church, and he says, with it we bless, talking about the tongue, the whole chapter is on the tongue. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men. He's talking about our inconsistency, who have been made in God's image. So he's saying it's inconsistent to use my tongue to praise God in church and then in the car on the way home slander everybody in the church. Because people in the church are image bearers. So I should not go around slandering people, speaking evil against people, because people matter to God because they have value. So the further and this is what's called sanctity of life. Sanctity of life is the idea that all human beings have value because they're image bearers of God. It doesn't matter if they're rich or poor. It doesn't matter if they're alcoholics or drug addicts or completely on the up and up. It doesn't matter if they're sleeping under the bridge, under a cardboard box. Every single human being has value because they're image bearers. And the fall didn't change it, then the flood didn't change it. And a lot of our commands in the New Testament regarding gossip relate to it. And the whole logic of the Noahic Covenant is based on it. So this is very different from the way our society is moving. The Bible teaches sanctity of life, and our society is moving towards an idea of people have value if they're useful. What's the word for it?
If they're contributing.
Yeah, if they're contributing. So if they're mentally retarded or, not educated or whatever their problem is, then our society is saying, well, they're not valuable anymore. But that's not Christianity. Christianity says the guy that's making millions of dollars is just as valuable as the homeless person, because they're all image bearers because of who they are in terms of how God made them. So that's why it's always Christians that are starting the orphanages. It's always Christians that are starting the soup kitchens. It's always the Christians that are starting the homes for unwed mothers. It's always... Do the atheists ever start these things? I mean, not that I know of. But it's always, as you look at who started these hospitals, even around this area, it's always some Christian group or Christian denomination, because this is a basic Christian teaching. Yeah, Vladimir?
Natural selection.
Yeah. Yeah, natural selection would go against this, completely against this. Yeah. Of James?
No, right here, it's just above it. But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, but full of deadly poison.
Poison?
How to just pray fast.
Oh, how do you...
Tongue under control. Keep it under control.
Oh, it's the heart. Yeah. Jesus said in Matthew 12:34, out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. So if we're harboring anger in our hearts, anger is going to come out of my mouth. What is the saying? What comes up in the bucket was down in the well. So I know this in my personal life. When I'm saying a bunch of stuff, I'm being sarcastic or something, I know there's some sinful heart condition. I haven't forgiven somebody or something. So, yeah, John?
Something else, when Pastor's doing a lesson on this is, we're only supposed to judge our brothers in sin, but most of the time when people come at somebody, it's more about, I don't think you did such a good job on this, or I don't think you're as intelligent, or you look funny, or you talk funny, or I don't like your personality, come on too strong, or you're too silly, but I mean, regardless of what we think, we're not accountable to what that person says about our image. We're only accountable towards God. And so, I mean, that's often how it was with David. None of them came at him saying, well, you're a wicked or you're a sinner. They came at him saying, well, you're short and you're worthless. And it doesn't have any, it's worthless talk. So.
Yep, good point. Another verse, we won't look it up, is 1 Corinthians 11, verse 7. That shows that man is an image bearer. And I didn't want to look it up because that gets into head coverings, and I just didn't want to deal with that. Take me for Acts, Paul, and we'll talk about it in there. But that's another verse. Those are the three verses that clearly show that we're image bearers despite the fall. So, what does it mean to be an image bearer of God? There are two ways that we are image bearers of God. The first is we are all sharers in His personal image. What does that mean? That means that we share in not His incommunicable attributes, but His what? Communicable attributes. There are things that we share with God in terms of qualities. Now, we don't share, obviously, in any of those things on the left in the perfect way God has in himself, but we do share in other things. For example, God is, and by the way, this applies to saved and unsaved. Okay. Is God social? Yeah, how do you know? Well, there's fellowship in the Trinity. So Jesus said, glorify me with the glory I had with you before the world was. There's intimacy, and so we consequently are social as well. God has personality, which is usually defined as intellect, emotions, and will. God thinks. God has emotions. He was grieved that he made Saul king. That's an emotion, isn't it? The anger of the Lord burned against Israel. God has a will. He said to Abraham, I will do this, I will do that for you. And we have all of those abilities. I have intellect, the capacity for thought, emotions, and the ability to choose. That's a scary one, by the way, the will that we have. Which means I could take my will and oppose God. I have that ability as an image bearer. So what's the smartest thing I can do with my will? Give it back to him. That's the smartest thing we could do. That's what Jesus role modeled for us. Not my will, but thy will. God is spiritual. John 4:24 says that Jesus, the Father, is meant to be worshipped in spirit and truth. And we have a spiritual quality. God is immortal. He'll never die. And guess what? You're immortal also. You'll never die. So even when your physical body stops, your soul is going to exist somewhere 1 trillion years from now. Now, we're a little bit different than God in the sense that he has always been. We were created at a certain point, but that doesn't mean that you somehow cease to exist. See, this is the problem with people that are contemplating suicide. The deception they're under is, well, my life is so bad, I'm just going to end it all. And the fact of the matter is, biblically speaking, a person's life doesn't end. You just transfer from the physical realm to the spiritual realm. And if you're not in Christ, your life gets a lot worse. The other side of eternity, see? So these are things you bring up in your counseling with people, because you're going to be dealing with suicidal individuals. God exercises dominion. He's a ruler. He rules the kingdom. He will rule the earthly kingdom one day. He rules, even so today, he rules a universal kingdom. Not the millennial kingdom, but he's always in control, right? So do we have dominion? Yes, God put Adam and Eve over the earth and said, we saw it in Genesis 1:26-28, rule, subdue. God is logical and rational. God, when he talks, he's logical. He means what he says what he means. And we have the capacity to be rational also. We can do mathematical formulas, and we can follow logical syllogisms. So all people are shares in God's personal image. And the key verse on it is Genesis 1:26-28. Yeah.
There's a few Christians that teach the your little God thing. Where did they get that from? Thinking that because we have dominion and all that stuff, or it's a wrong teaching, right?
Yeah, that is part of the positive confession mindset, that you are a king's kid. Some would say you're a little God. Now, the Bible never says we're little gods. It says we're image bearers of God. And so as a little God, you have the ability to speak things into reality like God does. So if you're a little bit low on the bank account, you just command money in there. And all that kind of stuff. And frankly, I don't know if I would want to ever be in that position. I mean, who do you want running your life? You, with our limited intellect and sinful impulses, or God? So I don't know if I'd even want to be a little God, frankly. I'd mess things up royally. But you're right, they get this idea from Genesis 1, and it's a misuse of the Scripture, and it makes God man's servant rather than the other way around. Now, we not only share in his personal image, but now this is very important, only the Christian, this doesn't apply to the non-believer, only the Christian can share in his moral image. And so here's a few verses on this. There's 2 verses. These will be on the test, just so you'll know. There's 2 verses that teach this. Who has Ephesians 4:23 and 24?
It reads, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness.
Okay, put on the new self, which is created after the likeness of God. That's not talking about personal image, that's talking about moral image. And remember, Paul wrote Ephesians and Colossians at the same time. When he was where? In prison. About AD 60 to 62. He was in prison in his first Roman imprisonment. He wrote the 4 prison letters. The first 2 are Ephesians and Colossians. What are the last 2 prison letters? No. Philemon and Philippians. And Colossae and Ephesus are only about 100 miles removed from each other. So Paul writes them from the same place, and he's writing to 2 cities that were in close proximity to each other. So a lot of the things that show up in Ephesians are also in Colossians, and vice versa. So you got to study the 2 books together. So Ephesians mentions our moral image, or potential for moral image, and so does Colossians 3:10. Who has that?
And put on the new self, which is being renewed to the true knowledge according to the image of the one.
Okay, put on the new self, which is being renewed to the true knowledge according to the image, see that? Of the one who created him. So when we share in God's moral image, we share in many of his attributes that are moral. So God is righteous. We, through the power of the Holy Spirit, have the ability to become righteous. Not perfectly, but hopefully our lives are not sinless, but we sin less. God is holy. We have the capacity for holiness. Not in my own power, by the way, as I yield to the Spirit that's inside of me on a moment-by-moment basis. God is truthful. We have the capacity to tell the truth. So on the reading report, it'll say, did you read the 500 pages? Or did you not? Or what percentage did you read? And you have the ability to tell the truth on that, right? Because you share in his moral image. Spiritual knowledge is mentioned in these passages. You know, we have a capacity to learn spiritual things just as God understands spiritual things. We don't know it to the same level he knows it, but the Spirit is given so that we might understand spiritual reality. So, all human beings share in his personal image, but only the Christian has the ability to share in his moral image. And that only comes through the process of progressive sanctification, which we'll be talking about when we get to soteriology. Some other facets of man that make us unique are, who has Psalm 8, verses 4 through 6. Okay, what is that? Psalm 8, what does that remind you of? What passage?
Genesis.
Yeah, it goes right back to Genesis. How we are made a certain way. God has put authority of the animal kingdom under our feet. And when the book of Hebrews quotes that passage, in Hebrews 2 verse 7, it says, man is made a little lower than the angels. So that's, think of the angels, I mean, they're way up there. And we're just a shade under the angels. That's our value. So I'm an image bearer, but I'm also created a little lower than the angels. Darwin is saying you're an accident. You're a cosmic accident. Different worldview.
Can you compare? Earlier we talked about how man has certain attributes that even angels don't have, and then here it's saying we're actually a little bit lower on the pole than the angels.
Mm-hmm.
Is that obviously there's some we can't move like angels move, obviously, locomotion. But in regards to other areas, what would you?
Well, they're stronger than we are. They're smarter than we are. I think it refer to things like that. They sit in the very heavens, with God, worshiping day and night. We don't do that. Yeah, holy, holy, holy. The ones that didn't fall are sinless. And something else that makes us unique is our complexity. Who has Psalm 139, verse 14?
I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well.
Okay, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. I mean, think of the capacity in our minds. I mean, think how complicated the mechanism is that God has given us just to think. Look at the complexity of our respiratory system, our cardiovascular system. Someone told me once that if you took out all of our, veins, it would go, and you line them up in a straight line, it would go miles and miles and miles. Have you guys heard something like that? So, I mean, we are magnificently complicated in how God has made us. And so that gives us value as well. So David, I don't know what he was doing. He was probably sitting under a tree or something, and he's kind of looking around. He's looking at himself, looking at how he was inhaling and exhaling, how he was hearing things, seeing things. And he said, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And of the 6 billion people on the planet, no two personalities are identical. No two fingerprints are the same. And so it is an amazing truth. And something else about us is we have all descended from one man. Who has Acts 17:26?
And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed time and the boundaries of their inhabitants.
So who did we all come from? From one man. Specifically says there, this is Paul preaching on Mars Hill, he made from one man every nation of mankind. So all of us are descendants of Adam. So what does that mean? That means there is no such thing as a pre-Adamic race of human beings. The gap theory that we talked about last time, some of those folks postulated that there was some sort of race that existed before Adam that perished when Satan rebelled between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis 1. And the Bible very clearly says there was no race of human beings before Adam. There's no hidden race out there that got lost. All of us are descended from Adam. And by the way, if you believe in a pre-Adamic race, then you have to believe that death occurred before what? Before the fall. So if you believe in a pre-Adamic race, you say, well, what happened to them? Well, they died off. And the Bible is very clear that death came into the world through whose sin? Adam's. Who has Romans 5:12?
Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all sinned.
So death spread to all men because all sinned through Adam. So you don't have death before Adam. God told Adam, the day you eat from the tree thereof is the day you will die. So there's no death beforehand. Romans 8:20 through 22.
For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now.
So the creation is in travail because of whose sin? Adam's. Adam's sin brought the whole thing into the human realm anyway. Did I give out Genesis 1:31? Yeah, can you read that?
God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there is evening, and there is morning, the sixth day.
So that's looking back on everything God created, going back to Genesis 1:1. And he doesn't just say it's good, he says it's what? Very good. So that statement doesn't fit real well with a race of people that died off beforehand. You can't fit the death of a whole race prior to Adam's fall. And this, I know this idea sounds weird about this pre-Adamic race, but just to show you that whatever you're doing with early issues in the Bible affects other areas of doctrine. If you believe in a pre-Adamic race, that affects your doctrine of missions, because you've got a bunch of people that are pre-Adamic that had children, right? Then you have people from Adam's line that have children. So the Bible says, Romans 5:12, that Adam's sin affected Adam's line. Now, if you believe in a pre-Adamic race, that means there could be a bunch of people living that weren't affected by what? Original sin. So this guy needs the gospel, this guy over here doesn't need the gospel. See what's going on here? So it does funny things to your doctrine of missions. So the lesson is, whatever you do in early Genesis, it's going to affect how you interpret other sections of the Bible. So you got to be very careful with, what we're doing with early Genesis. And not only does this idea that we're descended from one man rule out a pre-Adamic race, but this idea that we've descended from one man also rules out racism. Right? Why is there no basis for racism? Because all people, regardless of the pigment of their skin, bear whose image? God's. So somebody reread, whoever I assigned it to, Genesis 1:27 through 28.
God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.
So if all people are image bearers, the idea that one race is inferior to another does not come from the Scripture, right? Now, there are people, as you know, that use the Bible to justify racism. Have you seen that movie, Mississippi Burning, where they use, the curse of Ham or something like that to justify racism? And they're trying to say the black race is cursed based on that passage in Genesis. And the fact of the matter is that passage is talking about the Canaanites in the land of Israel who imitated the corrupt character of their father. Right? The Canaanites were bad people, not racially, but morally. So they were putting their children through fires and all that kind of stuff. So that's why they were cursed. It's got nothing to do with their skin color. Does that make any sense? So, the Bible's very clear of equality. A few passages. We are equal in terms of the fact that we're image bearers. We're equal because we've all inherited a sin nature, right? Regardless of skin color. We are all loved equally, regardless of skin color. For God so loved the world. The gospel is for make disciples of all nations. So all ethnicities are candidates for salvation, should they choose to believe the gospel. By the way, Revelation 5 and verse 9, can somebody look that up real fast? Describes people in heaven worshiping the Lord. I believe this is the church that has been raptured. And who does the church consist of? Who has Revelation 5:9?
And they sang a new song, saying, "Worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals. For you were slain and purchased for God, and your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation."
So who's worshiping the Lord there? Every tribe. It says every, right? Every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. So we're all equal in terms of redemption. So when you look at all these equalities we have, the most important being that we're all image bearers, you don't have any justification for racism at all. We're one race, like the Hitler, for example, thought the Aryan race was superior to the Jewish race. So if that's true, where does racism come from? It comes from perversions of the Bible, and it comes from, most people don't know this, it comes from Charles Darwin. Does anybody know the full title, without looking at the internet, the full title of Charles Darwin's book, published in 1859? Yeah, that's the part we all know. Origin of the Species is the title. Who knows what the subtitle is? Origin of the Species and the, watch this, preservation of the favored races. You say, what? Favored races? Some races are more favored than others? That's racism. Darwinism gives you the reason to be a racist. If you want to be a racist, you become Darwinistic. Because Darwin says one race has evolved higher than another race. Right? So the white race came from the monkeys. The black race came from the monkeys. But the white race is just a little bit further ahead evolutionary than the black race. You follow? So therefore the black race doesn't write as well, doesn't think as well, is not as smart. You follow that logic? So if you want to be a racist, you can justify it through Darwin, because you could say your race is higher than another race. Now, if you don't believe me, and this is a book you can read as part of your 500 pages of reading. It's by Henry Morris, and the title of it is The Long War Against God. We have it in our library. And it's a book not debunking evolution scientifically. Henry Morris was a scientist and he wrote many books debunking evolution scientifically. This is a book tracing the social effects of Darwin. What has Darwin socially caused? Yeah, exactly. He's got a chapter in there on racism. He's got a chapter in there on Marxism. You know, Marxism, which killed millions and millions of people. Karl Marx dedicated one of his volumes, Das Kapital, to Charles Darwin. John brought up the Holocaust. If you watch the movie Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, by Ben Stein, who's not, have you seen that?
Yes.
He's not a Christian, he's a devout Jew, Orthodox Jew. He's tracing how evolution has just taken over the fields of science, where if you're a creationist, you can't get a job, your grant money dries up magically, things like that. And he has the final section of the movie, he's talking about interviewing Holocaust survivors and things like that. And he's showing that it was Hitler using evolution that he uses as a potential justification for the Holocaust, because the Aryan race is more evolved than the Jews. See that? So, you know, I was in a faculty meeting here, and we have a very, as you know, African-American student body here. That's one of our outreaches at this school. And so everybody's trying to generate ideas, you know, regarding how we can, deal with the race issue. And nobody in the whole room is talking about Charles Darwin. And finally I put my hand up and I said, I really think we need to look at Charles Darwin. And everybody looked at me like I was from Mars or something. Because I believe, if you really want to deal with the racial issue, you got to deal with Darwin. Because Darwin gives you the justification for racism. And so take a look at this book and see if Henry Morris makes his case. So anyway, all this to say, the Bible is not racial. If people want to use the Bible to promote racism, they're twisting the Bible. The Bible basically teaches that all men are made in the image of God. And so you have people in history like William Wilberforce. Who was William Wilberforce?
He was from the slave movement.
He's an abolitionist from Parliament. And he used his position in Parliament to speak out against the slave trade. There's a whole movie about him. And eventually he got it abolished through perseverance, but why did he keep speaking out against it? Because he was an evangelical Christian. That's why.
He saw slaves as somebody that was the same as he was.
Yeah. And the Bible just doesn't teach that. By the way, we just had Martin Luther King Day. What was Martin Luther King's background? What was his occupation?
Pastor.
He was an ordained Baptist minister. So that's why he could look at the Jim Crow South and things like that as wrong, because of his belief that all men are made in the image bearers of God. So, yeah, I think we have a lot to say on the issue of racism, just by being biblicists. Yes, sir.
I think that another biblical issue is just it's bigger than racism. I think it's just man trying to put himself higher than another man, which is not biblical.
Yeah.
Because our authority is God. I mean, that's kind of the Melchizedek, the Caesarean Vassal thing. He was trying to show, I'm not going to receive from you because God is I'm higher. He's higher than me. And so, we start looking at ourselves and internalizing it. And back then, it wasn't just racism, just the age of conquest. I could conquer this whole nation because they're less technologically advanced. Therefore, they're less of a human being, and they know less, and that makes them stupid. So I'm going to take them over.
Yeah.
And it's all back to us exalting ourselves over each other.
Right. And since that's in our heart, we look for philosophies that justify what we want to do. Hitler found an ally in evolution. Karl Marx found an ally in evolution. Darwin found an ally in evolution. So anyway, that's just something to be aware of. Well, any questions or thoughts on this so far? So that's man as a unique creature. We're going to come back after the break. We'll take our break a little early. If you come back about 3:05, it gives you about 20 minutes. And we'll get into man's material nature, that's his body, and then his immaterial nature, that's his soul. So I'll see you in a few.